Today, the country of Greece is famous for being a great tourist destination, both because of its beautiful beaches and numerous historical monuments. In the past though, and especially during the Renaissance, ancient Greek culture was celebrated and deemed as the most influential one in history. Without doubt, Greece has left a deep and permanent impact on world history. Its ancient history being so romanticized that it often leaves the equally influential Greek medieval history remain neglected. In the short video, we will try to cover all periods of Greek history in a very simplified manner. This is not a professional history documentary. We merely want this video to provide our viewers with a basic understanding of Greek history. The history of the Greek people truly starts around 2000 BC with the arrival of the Mycenaeans in the Balkans. The Mycenaeans were an Indo-European group of tribes which were later influenced by another people, these people being the so-called Minoans. The Minoans, who populated the island of Crete, are now famous for the remains of the multiple impressive palace complexes they built. This Cretan civilization eventually collapsed due to unknown reasons around the 14th century BC. Following that, the Mycenaeans eventually came to occupy Crete. However, their civilization would collapse as well. A period known as the Greek Dark Age would begin, during which all writing would disappear and the level of sophistication among the Greek people would decline significantly. This dark period will come to an end around the 8th century BC, when writing and trade with foreign civilizations made a steady comeback. It is during this century that the famous Greek author Homer wrote one of the most influential works in ancient literature, the Iliad. A steady growth of the local settlements followed, and the establishment of several city-states, also known as polises. The most prominent of these cities were Sparta, Corinth and Athens, all of which began settling colonies throughout the Black and Mediterranean seas. Sparta was a highly militaristic state, governed by two kings. The majority of its population was made up of slaves, whom they referred to as helots. The free Spartans, on the other hand, had to go through a very harsh military training. This made the Spartan army very effective and enabled Sparta to conquer a large portion of the Peloponnesian Peninsula in southern Greece. In the meantime, Athens had overthrown its kings and was now ruled by an aristocratic assembly. In the 6th century BC, an influential Athenian politician called Solon would grant greater rights to the low-born Athenians. He did that without excluding much power from the hands of the nobility, and was because of this respected by both social classes. This would forestart a process that would transform Athens into the first democracy in the world. A process that would be refined by a man named Cleisthenes and completed in the 5th century with the reforms of another influential Athenian statesman, Pericles. Around the same time, a new powerful player had arrived on the scene. The powerful Persian Empire had just subjugated nearly all Greek colonies on the Anatolian Peninsula. These colonies would eventually rebel and would be granted support by the Athenians. This would eventually spark a war. The Persians would try to invade Greece on two occasions, however would be both times repelled by the joint efforts of the Greek city-states. Immediately following the elimination of the Persian threat, the Greeks began fighting among themselves. The two most influential city-states, Athens and Sparta, and their respective allies would clash in two bloody wars, now known as the Peloponnesian Wars. Sparta would eventually come on top, however would not be able to fully reap the rewards of its victory. The wars had exhausted both states, and they would so both enter a period of decline. Meanwhile, the northern Greek kingdom of Macedon began expanding rapidly under the rule of King Philip II, who subjugated nearly all of Greece and the Eastern Balkans. He was succeeded by his son, a certain Alexander the Great, who would come to conquer the entirety of the massive Persian Empire, in the way becoming one of the greatest conquerors in world history. Alexander's massive empire would collapse shortly after his death, when his Greek generals splintered it among each other, establishing the so-called satrap kingdoms. The former Macedonian general Ptolemy would come to rule Egypt, another one named Seleucus will consolidate his rule over Persia, and Antigones will eventually come to control most of central Greece and Macedonia. The Greek culture and language will spread all over the Middle East, beginning the so-called Hellenistic Period. Meanwhile, to the west, the Italian Roman Empire had become the dominant force in the Western Mediterranean and sought to expand eastwards. Shortly after crushing their main rivals, the Phoenician Carthaginians, the Romans began annexing the satrap kingdoms one by one. First to fall were the Macedonians in 150 BC, followed by the Seleucids and Ptolemaics in the following century. The Greeks lost their political independence, however, their culture was far from gone. Greek civilization was highly valued by the Romans and was kept alive in the eastern section of the empire. As Christianity spread into the Roman realm, so did Greek language, as it became the major tongue of the Christians. In the 4th century AD, the Roman Emperor Theodosius would once and for all split the empire into an eastern and western part. The Eastern Roman Empire, as it would come to be known, will in time become entirely dominated by Greek language and culture. Its magnificent capital of Constantinople would come to be regarded as the center of the Christian world. The Western Roman Empire eventually fell. However, as the East stood strong, Rome was not over. The empire had to be reunited, and one ambitious man stood up to the task. In the 6th century, Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian would spend his long reign in an attempt to reunify the Roman Empire. In the end, he succeeded in bringing much land back in Roman hands. However, his ambitious campaigns and a devastating plague had entirely drained the empire. Eastern Rome would then clash in a series of bloody and continuous wars with Persia. Despite losing at first, the Romans would, thanks to the competent Emperor Heraclius, manage to gain the upper hand. However, trouble was brewing to the south. A new religion called Islam had unified the tribes of Arabia, forming a vast empire which will conquer all of Persia and would eventually permanently strip the provinces of Africa, Syria and Egypt from eastern Rome. The Arabs will try to conquer Constantinople on multiple occasions, however will fail in all their attempts. Meanwhile, to the west, Bulgar and Slavic tribes would begin migrating in Byzantine territory in the Balkans. Despite all the crisis, the Christian empire would experience a short-term revival when Emperor Leo III and his heir, Constantine V, managed to score a number of victories against the Muslims and the newly formed Bulgarian Empire. A true Byzantine revival, however, would only begin with the rise of the Macedonian Dynasty, which was founded by a low-born wrestler named Basil, who managed to trick his way into becoming an emperor. In the 11th century, another member of the Macedonian dynasty named Basil II would reconquer a significant chunk of the lost Byzantine lands. He would once and for all topple the First Bulgarian Empire, which had a century ago nearly conquered all European lands of the Eastern Roman Empire. Only decades following the reign of Basil II, the Byzantines would lose all of the Anatolian Peninsula to the newly established Seljuk Turkish Empire. They will again regain most of Asia Minor thanks to the resilient Emperor Alexius Comnenus and his successors, his son and grandson John and Manuel Comnenus. The Comnenus dynasty would eventually be replaced by the largely incompetent Angeloi dynasty, under which the empire would lose ground to the resurgent Second Bulgarian Empire. In 1204, a Byzantine pretender to the throne would hire Western Crusaders as mercenaries. His newly acquired army would manage to bring him the Byzantine throne. Following the death of the pretender and a series of complicated events, however, the Crusaders would turn against the Byzantines and conquer their capital of Constantinople, forming an empire of their own, called the Latin Empire. Byzantium was not over yet. A Byzantine successor state, called the Empire of Nicaea, will within half a century reconquer Constantinople and re-establish the Eastern Roman Empire. This Byzantine Empire, however, was a mere shadow of its former self, and it would spend the next 2 centuries in a steady decline. The empire will slowly begin to lose land to the Bulgarians, Serbs and the Ottoman Beylik, a Turkish principality in western Anatolia. The final ones would prove to be the biggest threat. The Ottoman Turks will expand aggressively throughout the Balkan Peninsula in the 14th century. By the 1400s, Byzantium would be reduced only to Constantinople, which the Turks would sack and conquer in 1453, bringing the millennial-old Eastern Roman Empire to an end. For the next 3 centuries and a half, the Greeks will live as Ottoman subjects. Though heavy taxation and forced enlistment in the Turkish armies made life hard for the Greek people, the Ottomans allowed their Christian subjects some privileges. The Greeks in particular would come to dominate religious institutions all over the Balkans. This occurred because the other Christian peoples of the Ottoman Empire were not allowed to have their own independent institutions, but were instead subordinate to the Greek Church. The rise of nationalistic movements in 18th century Europe affected Greece as well. Intellectuals and authors attempted on reviving Greek culture and identity. In 1821, Greece will rise in a mass rebellion. The Greek War of Independence would begin. This uprising would be long and brutal, but the rebels would manage to successfully stand their ground against the huge Ottoman army. The many atrocities inflicted on Greek civilians would cause the great powers of Western Europe to intervene and finally help Greece gain its independence in 1828. The young country will develop and modernize quickly. Greek foreign politics in the following century would be dictated by the country's national question, the aim of unifying all Greeks in one state. Following the Russo-Turkish War of 1878 and the two Balkan Wars, Greece will nearly double its territory. After joining the winning side in World War I in 1917 and gaining even more territory, the Greeks would clash in a war with the Turks. Despite being successful at first, the Greek army would eventually be repelled by the newly established Turkish Republic. The rest of the 20th century would be a harsh period for the Greek people. The Great Depression caused economic issues in the 30s. In the 40s, with the beginning of World War II, Greece tried remaining neutral. However, Italy was keen on launching an invasion on the country. After attempting multiple annexations and failing every time because of strong Greek resistance, the Italians would eventually seek help from Germany, which the Germans would deliver, and Greece would finally be invaded. Even after successfully liberating their country mostly on their own in 1944, the Greek people will almost immediately have to deal with another crisis. Their country would undergo a civil war, in which Soviet-sponsored groups will try on installing a communist government, but would ultimately fail. A far-right authoritarian regime will be established in the country in 1967. It will, however, collapse soon after in 1974, and Greek democracy will be restored. Greece will from then on experience a steady development and, despite some economic problems during the 2008 recession, would become the Greece we know and love today. A fantastic tourist destination and a relatively affluent state, with a population rightfully proud of the massive cultural and historical legacy of their country.